Rain poured over the alien city, turning the stone streets into black mirrors. Crowds pressed together in the wide square, their voices loud, their eyes fixed on the raised platform in the center. On that platform stood a young alien girl, wrists bound with heavy iron cuffs, a chain pulling her to a thick post behind her. Her skin was pale from exhaustion, her clothes torn and dirty. Still, her eyes burned with something stronger than fear: defiance. The smell of wet stone mixed with the sharp scent of the energy pike resting in the executioner's hands. The weapon hummed, glowing faintly in the gray light. Every vibration of it was a promise of what was about to happen. From the edge of the crowd, a lone human pushed forward. He was tall, wrapped in a dark coat already soaked through. The people around him moved reluctantly, some muttering insults under their breath. Humans were rare here, unwanted, distrusted, and his presence in this place was like a spark in a powder room. On the platform, a robed alien magistrate stepped forward and unrolled a long scroll. His voice cut through the rain. Lyra of the Ninth House, found guilty of treason, of aiding the enemies of the Empire, of stealing codes belonging to the High Guard. The magistrate's eyes swept over the crowd, letting the words settle. Sentence, death, to be carried out immediately. The crowd roared. Some shouted for her to beg for forgiveness. Others screamed for the executioner to start. But Lyra said nothing. Her jaw was set, her head held high despite the chains biting into her skin. The human kept moving, slipping through the press of bodies. He ignored the shoves, the curses. His eyes were fixed on the girl. The magistrate nodded to the executioner. The pike's glow intensified, its hum turning into a sharp buzz. The weapon was raised, the point aimed directly at her chest. "Stop!" The human's voice carried above the rain and the noise. The square fell silent. Every head turned toward him. The executioner froze, mid-swing. Lyra's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before narrowing again in suspicion. The magistrate's gaze hardened. Who dares interrupt the will of the court? The human stepped into the open space at the front of the crowd, boots splashing in the puddles. His coat clung to him, and steam rose faintly from his breath in the cold air. "I do," he said, his voice even. "By the old code, I claim the right to stand for the condemned." Gasps moved through the crowd like wind. The old code was a law so ancient that most thought it was a myth, a warrior's right to challenge an execution by trial, not for himself, but for another. Few had even heard it spoken aloud. The magistrate gave a low, humorless laugh. "A human? Speaking of our laws? You are far from your home, stranger." "Far enough to know your law still binds you," the human replied. The magistrate's expression sharpened, the faintest twitch of his jaw betraying his annoyance. He turned to the guards. "Remove him." But the human didn't move. "Touch me," he said, "and the people will know you break your own traditions." The guards hesitated. The rain seemed to grow louder, each drop striking the stone like a drumbeat. In the stillness, Lyra studied him with unblinking eyes. She clearly didn't know why he was here. The magistrate finally gestured to the executioner, who lowered the pike but kept it ready. "State your name." "Daniel Cross," the human said, "and I challenge the verdict. I will fight in her place. If I win, she goes free." Murmurs erupted in the crowd. Some found it absurd, others thrilling. A fight to decide life or death was rare entertainment. The magistrate stared at him for a long moment. "You understand the consequence? You will face our champion. He will not show mercy. If you fall, she dies, and so will you." Daniel's eyes never left Lyra. "Then I'll have to make sure I don't fall." The magistrate turned to the crowd. "By ancient law, the challenge stands. The duel will be held at dawn." Guards moved forward, this time not to remove him, but to escort both Daniel and Lyra away from the platform. As they passed, Lyra finally spoke, her voice low but sharp. "Why are you doing this?" Daniel glanced at her. "Because once, a long time ago, you did the same for me." Before she could ask more, the guards pulled them apart. The crowd began to cheer, not for her freedom, but for the blood they hoped to see spilled the next day. Rain kept falling, washing over the stone, over the chains, over the place where life and death had just been wagered. The guards pushed Daniel through a narrow stone corridor, the walls damp and cold. Torches burned low in iron brackets, casting long shadows. Behind him, 2 more guards dragged Lyra in the opposite direction. She didn't look back. They brought Daniel into a small empty chamber with a single bench and a barred window high above the wall. The smell of old blood lingered faintly in the air. One guard slammed the door shut, leaving him alone. For a moment, he just sat there, letting the silence settle. Then footsteps approached. The door creaked open and the alien magistrate entered, robes brushing the floor. He closed the door behind him. "You are either very brave, human, or very stupid," the magistrate said, his voice calm but edged with mockery. Daniel met his eyes without flinching. "Maybe both. You do realize our champion has fought 34 challenges," the magistrate continued. "None have lasted more than a minute." "I'm not here to break records," Daniel replied. "I'm here to win." The magistrate gave a slow smile, as if amused by the idea. "Why risk your life for her? She's a criminal, a traitor. Even her own people spat on her name." Daniel didn't answer. The magistrate leaned closer, lowering his voice. "If you walk away now, I can still spare your life. The crowd will forget, but if you go through with this, you will die." Daniel stayed silent, his jaw tightening. Finally, the magistrate straightened and turned to leave. "So be it. At dawn, the square will taste blood." He left without another word. Hours passed before the door opened again. This time, it was not a guard, but an older alien man with a long scar down his neck. He carried a bundle wrapped in cloth. "I'm the armorer," he said simply. He placed the bundle on the bench and unwrapped it to reveal a single combat knife, its blade worn but sharp. "This is all you're allowed. The champion will have the same." Daniel took the knife and felt its balance. It was heavier than he liked, but he could work with it. "What's his style?" he asked. The armorer hesitated. "Brutal. He likes to end fights with one blow to the chest. If he misses, he breaks bones. You won't match his strength." Daniel gave a faint smile. "I wasn't planning to." The armorer studied him for a moment, then left without another word. Later, the door opened again. This time it was the guards, HFY, and between them was Lyra. Her wrists were still chained, but her eyes were fixed on him. The guards pushed her inside, then shut the door, leaving them together for the first time since the square. "You're insane," she said without hesitation. "You don't even know what you're up against." "I've seen worse," Daniel replied. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't care." Her voice cracked slightly, but she turned away so he wouldn't see. He stepped closer. "You remember the outpost on Harrow Ridge? 3 soldiers, 2 drones, and 1 badly injured human? You could have left me to die, but you didn't." Her eyes flickered. "That was years ago. And now it's my turn." For a moment, they just stood there, the sound of rain faint through the high window. Finally, she shook her head. "You're going to get yourself killed." "Maybe," he said, "but not before I try." The door opened again, and the guards came to take her away. As they pulled her toward the corridor, she glanced back at him. "If you lose, make it quick," she said softly. When the door closed, Daniel sat on the bench and began going over every move in his head. He wasn't the strongest, but he had speed, timing, and something the champion might not expect: unpredictability. Through the night, he didn't sleep. He practiced grips with the knife, imagined the champion's reach, and thought of ways to use the arena itself. By the time the first light of dawn touched the bars of the window, the guards returned. They chained his wrists and led him out into the open air. The rain had stopped, but the square was already filling with people, eager for blood. In the distance, Daniel saw the champion waiting at the center of the arena, a towering alien in light armor, his arms bare to show his strength. He stood perfectly still, but even from here, Daniel could feel the weight of his presence. The guards pushed Daniel forward. The crowd's roar grew louder, a deep, hungry sound. Somewhere above, in the magistrate's balcony, Lyra stood between 2 guards, her expression unreadable. Daniel gripped the knife, feeling the rough texture of the handle. He took a slow breath, eyes never leaving the champion. The duel was about to begin. The champion stepped forward, the ground trembling faintly under his weight. His skin was a deep bronze, his shoulders massive, and scars crisscrossed his arms like a history of every battle he had ever fought. A long black crest of hair ran down the center of his head, swaying slightly with each movement. His eyes were fixed on Daniel, with the cold focus of a predator sizing up its prey. Daniel kept his step steady as he entered the arena. The crowd surrounded them on all sides, packed tight into the stands. The air was thick with the smell of dust and sweat. High above, the magistrate watched with a smug expression, certain this match would be short. Lyra stood beside him, her face pale but her gaze sharp, tracking every movement. The referee, a thin alien with a voice like gravel, stepped between them. Combat will end when one fighter is unable to continue or yields. No killing blow unless necessary to secure victory. His eyes flicked toward the champion. Begin. The champion didn't charge right away. He circled slowly, watching Daniel, his knife held low but ready. Daniel mirrored his movements, keeping light on his feet, his knife angled defensively. Then, without warning, the champion lunged. His speed was shocking for his size, his blade slicing through the air toward Daniel's chest. Daniel twisted aside just in time, feeling the rush of air as the blade missed him by inches. The crowd roared. Daniel didn't try to strike back immediately. Instead, he kept moving, forcing the champion to chase him, making him spend energy. Each time the champion attacked, Daniel dodged just far enough to avoid the blade, never letting him land a solid hit. But the champion was smart. After a few exchanges, he began feinting, pretending to strike in one direction, then attacking from another. One feint worked, and the champion's fist slammed into Daniel's ribs, sending a sharp pain shooting through his side. Daniel staggered back, catching his breath. The champion grinned, sensing weakness. He came in again, heavier this time, forcing Daniel toward the edge of the arena. Daniel ducked under another swing, rolled, and came up behind him, slashing toward his back. The champion twisted just in time, and Daniel's blade only grazed his armor. The cut wasn't deep, but it drew the crowd's attention. Cheers and shouts erupted from all sides. The champion's grin disappeared. He moved faster now, his attacks relentless. Daniel blocked one strike, then another, but each impact numbed his arm. A downward blow knocked the knife from his hand, sending it skidding across the sand. The crowd gasped. Daniel backed away, empty-handed, as the champion stalked toward him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The champion raised his blade for a killing strike. Lyra's hands clenched against the railing above, her lips parting as if to shout something. Daniel didn't wait. As the blade came down, he sidestepped, letting the champion's own momentum carry him forward. Daniel grabbed his arm, twisting it, and slammed his knee into the champion's side. It barely slowed him, but it gave Daniel enough time to dive toward the fallen knife. His fingers closed around the handle just as the champion's shadow fell over him again. Daniel rolled away, the blade coming up between them. Now it was his turn to press forward. He darted in, feinted left, then slashed right, aiming for the joints in the champion's armor. Twice the champion blocked him, but on the third attempt, Daniel's blade bit into the gap at the elbow, drawing a thin line of blood. The champion roared, swinging wildly. Daniel ducked, the blade passing just over his head. Every muscle in his body burned, his ribs aching with each breath. But he could see it now. The champion was just slightly slower than before, his breath heavier. Daniel had to keep moving, keep forcing him to make mistakes. The crowd's cheers turned into a chant, half calling for the champion, half for the human. The noise shook the air, but Daniel blocked it out. All that mattered was the next move, the next second. The champion came in again, a brutal overhead strike. Daniel caught the blade on his own, twisting their arms together in a lock. For a brief moment they were face to face, their muscles straining, neither willing to give ground. The champion's eyes narrowed. "You will break." Daniel's voice was low but steady. "Not today." He suddenly released the pressure, letting the champion stumble forward, then slammed his shoulder into him, knocking him off balance. The move worked, but it also left Daniel dangerously close, within the champion's reach. A massive fist caught him across the jaw, sending him sprawling. His vision blurred for a heartbeat, and the taste of blood filled his mouth. He forced himself back up, knife still in hand. The champion was already charging. Lyra's voice cut through the noise, sharp and urgent. "Daniel!" He turned his head just enough to see her pointing at something near the arena wall, a section where the sand was darker, damp. It might be loose ground. The champion came in swinging. Daniel sidestepped toward the patch, baiting him to follow. The fight wasn't over yet. Daniel's boots sank slightly into the damp patch of sand. It was softer here, harder to push off from, but he had a plan. The champion, too focused on ending the fight, didn't notice. His massive form charged forward, blade raised high. At the last second, Daniel stepped aside. The champion's foot landed squarely in the wet ground, sinking just enough to throw off his balance. His swing came down slower, less controlled. Daniel ducked under it and slashed at the exposed side of his leg. The blade cut deep through flesh before catching on armor. The champion roared in pain, yanking his leg free, sending clumps of wet sand flying. The crowd exploded with noise, half in outrage, half in excitement. Daniel didn't wait. He pressed forward, jabbing toward the champion's chest, forcing him to defend. Each strike pushed the bigger man back, step by heavy step. But the champion's strength was terrifying. With one counter, he caught Daniel's arm and flung him aside. Daniel hit the ground hard, air rushing out of his lungs. The sand scraped against his cheek, the taste of grit filling his mouth. He forced himself up just as the champion stomped forward, limping slightly but still deadly. They clashed again, steel ringing in the air. The champion's blows came faster now, as if he wanted to end it quickly before his injury slowed him more. Daniel barely managed to parry, his arms aching with each impact. One hit glanced off his shoulder, sending a flash of pain down his arm. Up in the balcony, Lyra gripped the railing so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Every strike the champion landed felt like it struck her too. She could see Daniel slowing, his movements growing tighter, more defensive. The champion feinted high, then drove his knee into Daniel's stomach. Daniel folded forward, gasping, and the champion's fist slammed into the side of his head. The world tilted, the roar of the crowd fading into a dull hum. Daniel staggered, barely holding onto his knife. The champion raised his blade for the final blow. Somewhere in the haze, Daniel remembered a lesson from years ago. An old instructor's voice. When you can't match strength, use what they give you. As the champion swung, Daniel didn't block. He stepped into the attack, twisting his body so the blade missed by inches, then grabbed the champion's wrist with both hands. He used the man's own momentum to pull him forward and down, driving the point of his own knife toward the champion's neck. The bigger man twisted, the blade cutting across his collar instead. Not fatal, but enough to draw another roar of pain. Daniel backed off, sucking in quick breaths. His ribs screamed with every inhale, and blood dripped from a cut above his brow into his eye. But the champion was bleeding too, slowly, steadily. The crowd's chant grew louder, a wild mix of names and curses. The magistrate's smug smile was gone, replaced by a tight frown. The champion, furious now, came at Daniel like a storm. Every step shook the ground, every swing a blur of steel. Daniel gave ground, letting him burn energy. He kept his eyes on that injured leg, waiting for the right opening. It came when the champion overextended, his foot landing in the same wet patch again. Daniel lunged, ramming his shoulder into the man's chest. The champion stumbled, dropping to one knee. Without hesitation, Daniel slashed at the back of his knee, cutting through armor straps. The champion roared and spun, backhanding Daniel across the face. The blow sent him rolling across the sand, but the damage was done. The champion's leg buckled when he tried to stand. Daniel dragged himself to his feet, spitting blood. He could barely feel his arms, but he tightened his grip on the knife. The champion realized too late that his mobility was gone. He swung wildly, trying to keep Daniel at bay, but his movements had lost their precision. Daniel moved in close, ducking under a desperate slash, and slammed the pommel of his knife into the champion's jaw. The bigger man staggered back. Daniel struck again, this time driving the blade across his forearm, forcing him to drop his weapon. The crowd erupted, the noise shaking the arena. The champion was breathing hard, his eyes still fierce, but his body failing him. He looked at Daniel for a long moment, then dropped to one knee, pressing a fist to the ground in surrender. The referee stepped forward, raising his voice above the roar. "Victory! Daniel Cross!" The crowd split into cheers and angry shouts. Daniel stood there, swaying slightly, his knife still in hand. His chest rose and fell in ragged breaths. Up in the balcony, Lyra's lips parted in disbelief. She had expected courage from him, but not victory. The magistrate's voice cut through the noise, sharp and bitter. By the law, the girl walks free. Daniel sheathed his knife, his eyes finding Lyra's. For a brief moment, in the middle of the noise and chaos, they shared a silent look. Then the sound of movement broke it, shadows shifting at the edges of the arena. Figures in dark armor stepped forward, weapons drawn. The crowd's cheers faltered. Assassins. The assassins moved like shadows, their black armor glinting faintly under the pale light. Each carried curved blades and short, silent crossbows strapped to their backs. They didn't come from the arena gates. They had slipped in through hidden passages along the walls. Daniel's muscles ached from the fight, but his grip tightened on his knife. He took a step toward Lyra's balcony, but the assassins dropped down into the arena, forming a circle around him. The crowd began to murmur. Some backed away from the rails, sensing danger. Others leaned forward, eager for more violence. The magistrate remained seated, his expression unreadable. Lyra's eyes widened. She turned toward him, her voice sharp. "What is this? The challenge is over." The magistrate didn't look at her. "Yes, and now the sentence is carried out properly." Daniel understood then. This had been the plan all along. Even if he won, they would kill him and take Lyra anyway. The first assassin stepped in, slashing low. Daniel blocked, but the impact sent pain shooting through his ribs. Another came from behind, forcing him to spin and deflect. Every movement was slower now, every breath heavier. Two assassins lunged at once. Daniel ducked, letting them crash into each other, and drove his knife into the thigh of the one on his left. The man cried out and fell, but the others didn't stop. The crowd's noise grew uneasy. This wasn't the honorable combat they had come to see. This was slaughter. From the balcony, Lyra made a sudden move. She twisted out of the guard's grip and leaped over the railing, hitting the sand hard. Pain shot through her knees, but she forced herself up and grabbed a fallen assassin's blade. Daniel glanced at her in shock. "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should you," she shot back, stepping into the fight beside him. They moved together, covering each other's backs. Daniel ducked a strike meant for his neck, while Lyra drove her blade into an assassin's side. Blood splattered across the sand. Another came at her from the right, but Daniel blocked, countering with a quick slash across the man's arm. One by one, the assassins began to fall, but they fought like men with nothing to lose. Even wounded, they pressed forward. Up in the stands, the crowd began to chant, not for the assassins, not for the magistrate, but for Daniel and Lyra. The noise swelled until it echoed off the arena walls. The magistrate stood, fury twisting his face. "Kill them both," he shouted. The last three assassins charged together. Daniel grabbed Lyra's arm, pulling her aside, and hurled a handful of sand into their faces. As they flinched, blinded, he struck, quick, efficient, cutting them down before they could recover. When the final body hit the ground, the arena went silent, except for the sound of Daniel's breathing. His knife was slick with blood, his clothes torn and stained. He turned toward the magistrate, pointing the blade at him. "If you send another one, I'll come for you next." Gasps ran through the crowd. No one spoke to the magistrate like that. The older alien's eyes narrowed. Guards. But the guards didn't move. The crowd was watching, their loyalty shifting. The law had been upheld, then broken. If the magistrate ordered Daniel's death now, it would start a riot. Instead, the magistrate forced a thin smile. "Leave, both of you, and never return." Daniel didn't wait. He grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her toward the nearest gate. The crowd parted for them, some reaching out to touch his arm, others shouting their names. Once they were outside the arena walls, they didn't stop running. Through narrow streets and under stone arches, they pushed on until the sound of the crowd faded behind them. Finally, in the shadow of an abandoned market, they stopped to catch their breath. Daniel leaned against a wall, his ribs aching with every inhale. Lyra kept watch at the alley's end, her stolen blade still in hand. "They won't stop," she said quietly. "Not after today." "I know," Daniel replied, "which means we don't stop either." She turned to him, her eyes searching. "Why keep going? You've done enough. You could walk away." Daniel shook his head. "And leave you for them to finish the job? Not happening." For a moment, they stood in silence, rain starting to fall again, pattering softly on the cobblestones. Then Lyra spoke, her voice low. "There's something you don't know. The reason they wanted me dead, it's not just treason." He looked at her, waiting. "I have something," she said. "Something they can't afford to lose. And if we can get it to the right people, it could stop a war." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then we get it there." From somewhere deeper in the city, a horn sounded, the sharp, metallic note of soldiers on the move. Lyra's grip on her blade tightened. "They've already started looking." Daniel stepped away from the wall, ignoring the pain in his side. "Then we stay ahead of them. Let's move." They disappeared into the rain-soaked streets, the horn echoing behind them, knowing that every step from here on would be a fight for survival. They kept to the narrowest streets, moving quickly under dripping balconies and broken stone arches. Every shadow seemed to hold danger, every sound behind them a possible pursuer. Daniel's ribs throbbed with each step, but he didn't slow. Lyra walked close at his side, her stolen blade hidden beneath her torn cloak. Twice, they had to duck into dark doorways as patrols marched past, their armor clinking in the rain. Once, a squad of soldiers stopped just a few steps away, speaking in low voices. Daniel held his breath until their boots faded into the distance. "We can't keep running in the open," Lyra whispered. "They'll close the city gates soon." Daniel glanced around, spotting a narrow alley sloping downward toward the old quarter. "Then we disappear before that happens." The old quarter was a maze of leaning buildings and twisted passages, a place the guards avoided unless they came in numbers. The streets smelled of damp stone and old smoke, and most doors were shut tight against the weather. Stray figures moved quickly, eyes down, not wanting to be noticed. Daniel led Lyra into a crumbling courtyard where half the walls had fallen in. "We rest here," he said. Lyra hesitated. "Not for long." Daniel sank onto a broken stone step, pulling off his coat. His shirt was soaked with blood from the fight, but most of it had already dried. Lyra knelt beside him and tore a strip from her cloak, binding his ribs as tightly as she could. "You should have stayed away from me," she said quietly. "You've said that before," Daniel replied, meeting her eyes. "And I'm still here." For a moment, her gaze softened, but then she looked away. "What I have, it's a data crystal. It contains proof of the Empire's plan to start a war with your people. If it gets out, it could stop them. If it doesn't..." She didn't finish the sentence. Daniel leaned back against the wall. "Where is it?" She pulled a small silver shard from a hidden pocket in her belt. "Right here." The crystal caught the dim light, its surface shifting faintly like liquid. "You've been carrying it this whole time?" "Where else could I hide it?" she asked. "If they catch me, they'll kill me before I can speak. And if they catch you with it, they'll do worse." Before Daniel could answer, movement flickered in the shadows beyond the courtyard. Lyra saw it too, two figures slipping closer, knives in hand. Daniel was on his feet instantly. "We're leaving." They darted through a gap in the wall, racing into the narrow street beyond. The pursuers followed, their footsteps echoing against the stone. Daniel led them in a zigzag pattern, turning sharply into side alleys to break line of sight. But the sound of boots behind them didn't fade. More were joining the chase. Up ahead, the alley split. Daniel took the left path, knowing it would lead toward the drainage tunnels. The smell of wet earth and stagnant water grew stronger. They reached a low archway, half hidden by weeds. Daniel crouched and slipped inside, pulling Lyra with him. The tunnel beyond was pitch black, the air damp and cold. Water dripped steadily from somewhere ahead. The sound of footsteps entered the tunnel behind them. "Go," Daniel whispered, pushing her forward. They moved through the darkness, guided by touch and faint echoes. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them to walk single file. The sound of their pursuers grew louder, closer. Daniel stopped suddenly, feeling the rough stone of a side passage. This way. The side passage twisted upward, ending in a rusted grate. Daniel put his shoulder against it and shoved until it gave way, the metal screeching as it fell aside. They climbed out into an overgrown garden behind a shuttered house. For a moment, there was silence, then the sound of soldiers spilling from the tunnel. Daniel grabbed Lyra's hand. "Run." They crossed the garden and slipped through a broken door into the house. Inside, dust covered the floors, and old furniture sat under sheets. They moved carefully from room to room until they reached the front, peering out through a cracked window. The street was empty. Lyra let out a slow breath. "We lost them." "Not for long," Daniel said. "We need to get out of the city before nightfall." They made their way toward the outer district, keeping to back streets. The rain had slowed, leaving the air heavy and damp. The city gates were still open, but guards were checking every person who passed through. Daniel scanned the street, spotting a wagon loaded with barrels waiting near the gate. The driver was arguing with a guard, giving them a perfect distraction. "Inside," Daniel said, pulling Lyra toward the wagon. They slipped between the barrels just as the driver climbed back up, snapping the reins. The wagon rolled forward. Through the gaps, Daniel saw the guards barely glance inside before waving them through. Only when the sound of the city faded behind them did he finally relax. Lyra shifted beside him. "You just risked your life twice in one day for me." Daniel gave a faint smile. "Let's hope I don't have to make it 3. They rode on into the open land beyond the city walls, the road stretching ahead into darkness. The road beyond the city was rough and muddy from the rain. The wagon jolted with every rut, the barrels shifting slightly around them. Daniel kept one arm braced against the side, the other resting near the hilt of his knife. Lyra sat close, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the slats. After an hour, the driver stopped at a crossroads to water the horse. Daniel tapped Lyra's arm and nodded toward the open fields. They slipped from the wagon without a sound, disappearing into the tall grass before the driver even noticed. The night was quiet except for the distant rumble of thunder. Stars broke through the thinning clouds, casting pale light over the fields. Daniel led them away from the road, taking a winding path toward the low hills ahead. "We can rest there," he said, pointing to a cluster of rocks on the slope. When they reached the rocks, they settled in the shadows. Daniel built a small fire, shielding it from view. The warmth was a relief after the damp chill of the road. Lyra sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a cup of water he'd poured from his canteen. "They'll follow us," she said quietly. "I know," he replied, "but they'll have to find us first." She studied him for a moment. "Why are you like this? Most people look out for themselves. You look out for me." Daniel shrugged slightly. "I've been in places where no one came for me. I decided I wouldn't be that person." Her gaze softened, but before she could answer, a faint sound came from the darkness below, boots in the grass. Daniel put a finger to his lips, dousing the fire with a quick sweep of dirt. They pressed themselves against the rocks, listening. Voices carried on the wind, low but urgent. "They're close," Lyra whispered. Daniel glanced around, spotting a narrow crevice between two boulders. "In here." They slipped inside, the stone cold against their backs. The space was just wide enough for them to press together in the dark. The footsteps drew nearer, passing so close Daniel could see the glint of moonlight on a crossbow bolt. The soldiers moved on, their voices fading. They stayed in the crevice a few minutes longer before Daniel stepped out to check the area. When it was clear, they started moving again, heading deeper into the hills. By dawn, they reached a ridge that overlooked a wide valley. In the distance, beyond the mist, a thin line of silver shimmered. "The border river," Lyra said. Daniel nodded. "Once we cross, they can't follow without starting an incident. You'll be safe." They began the descent, but halfway down, movement caught Daniel's eye, riders emerging from the trees below. At least 6, moving fast. "They're cutting us off," he said. They broke into a run, sliding down the slope. The riders shouted, urging their mounts faster. The pounding of hooves shook the ground. When they reached the valley floor, Daniel spotted an old wooden bridge spanning the river. Its planks were worn and the supports sagged, but it was the only way across. "Go!" he shouted. Lyra sprinted for the bridge while Daniel turned to face the riders, knife in hand. The first one reached him, swinging a short sword. Daniel ducked, slashing at the rider's leg. The man cried out, toppling from the saddle. Another came in from the side. Daniel grabbed the horse's bridle, yanking hard until the animal reared, throwing its rider. He shoved the man aside and ran for the bridge. Lyra was halfway across, the old planks groaning under her weight. Daniel followed, but the riders were right behind. When they reached the middle, Daniel stopped and kicked at one of the loose boards. It splintered, leaving a gap big enough to slow pursuit. He and Lyra crossed the last few steps together, leaping onto the far bank. The riders pulled up short, their mounts snorting nervously at the weak boards. None dared follow. Lyra stood breathing hard, the river rushing between them and their pursuers. "We made it." Daniel scanned the opposite bank. "For now." They moved into the trees, following a narrow path along the river. The sunlight grew warmer, and for the first time since the arena, they could walk without looking over their shoulders every second. By midday, they reached a small settlement. The people here were wary at first, but when Lyra quietly showed the silver crystal to the local elder, his expression changed. He agreed to hide them until transport could be arranged to a secure location. That night, in a small wooden hut, Lyra sat beside the fire, turning the crystal over in her hands. When this reaches the right people, it could stop everything. No more raids. No more war. Daniel leaned back against the wall, watching the flames. Then we'll make sure it gets there. She looked at him, her voice softer. You didn't just save my life, Daniel. You gave me a future. He gave a small smile, just returning the favor. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of distant horns. The war wasn't over, but for tonight, they had won.